Really excited today to have Tom Mauriello with us. He's the executive director of Reliant, and we go back several years, and we're really glad to have him on this webinar today. He's really passionate about leading the organization and the team to accomplish their mission, which is mobilizing missionaries for the Great Commission. As executive director, he acts as a bridge between the board's direction and the day-to-day operations. And the main thing that he really loves is being able to support and come under the mission of so many amazing churches, missionaries, and ministries that are doing great kingdom work around the world. So they are just an amazing engine to undergird the financial aspect of ministry. And so we're really privileged to have him with us today. And then, of course, we have JR. JR is the leader of the V3 movement. He has written Creating a Missional Culture. He has been focusing on planting churches on the East Coast and the West Coast over the last 25 years. He also has written the Church as Movement and as a co-founder with the Missio Alliance. And we're really excited to have him as always. And I'm Lori Ruffin. I am the operations manager for the V3 movement, as well as the founder of the COO team, a virtual operations agency that helps nonprofits and small businesses. And so we're really glad to have you today. We are going to invite Tom to lead us through some ideas that will help us. But before we do, we want to just say that this time is brought to you by the V3 Learning Cohorts. The V3 Church Planting Movement has a learning cohort that provides in-depth training for church planters. And so it's a cohort that starts in mid-August and goes all the way through mid-May. And it's really about hands-on practice, looking at the core competencies of church planting. And it's really a great experience for holistic, communal, peer-based practice and process-oriented training where you're learning and doing. So we want to let you know that we accept applications all throughout the year. You can learn more about that at the v3movement.org. And we will be reviewing those applications in the spring and starting next summer. So if you are a church planter and you are looking for training and you're looking to be a part of like-minded people who are really focused on the grounded missional practice and grounded missional practice, we want to invite you to follow up there. We also want to say we're really excited. We've got an app. So if you go to Google Play, you go to iTunes, you go to Amazon.com, the V3 Movement has tons of resources that are available there. And so you can find us by searching for the V3 Movement, the V3 Movement. And that app is really great because it can get that we have, even for those who are not a part of the learning cohort. So we're really excited about that. We've launched it this fall. We would encourage you to join there, and you also can apply directly through the app. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tom, and he's going to share some really exciting information with us. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to drop down into the Q&A section and add any questions that you have there. And at the end of the call, we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lori. Welcome all. It's good to be with you today. It's an honor to join the webcast. And as she shared, I'm Tom Mauriello, the Executive Director of Reliant, and we love partnering with V3 and church planters really all over the world. And it's a personal privilege to be a part of it. So we wanted to talk today is about funding the mission. And two kind of key points for that is missional church planting, that as we seek to reach the unreached places, the broken places, the dry communities that are in need of Christ and the gospel, we're going to need different funding models than we've traditionally looked at. And one of the key points to make is that your funding model will affect the mission of the church. And I think this is an important point. Often when we're looking at planting, we are starting a new mission, we're starting a new endeavor, and we are passionate about reaching the lost, about affecting lives, about bringing real change, and we make our plans along those lines. And then we kind of stop and say, but we probably need to be funded. We probably need income for ourselves, for our family, for the cost of the ministry. And so often in church planting, we start with saying we want a new missional approach to church planting. But then when we think about funding, we fall back to a traditional tithe-based model. Often saying, okay, we need a church that is self-sufficient in 3 years with a local tithe, or looking to be dependent on large gifts. And what we find is, you've probably heard it, where we say systems are not neutral. And what you find in churches and church plants, that the best way to get to a self-sustaining tithe in 3 years is to reach Christians, to reach the reached that are ready to give and to fund. And so our funding model can actually pull us off course. And so what I want to talk about today a little bit is the missionary model. It's what we specialize here at Reliant. Also talk about bivocational church planting and some pitfalls we can fall into when we are thinking about creative funding or other ways to fund a church plant. But it is really critical, because this funding model, or how you think about the economics of the church, can either keep you on mission or will pull you off mission. First, I want to talk about the missionary model of fundraising. And what we mean by the missionary model of fundraising is a fundraising mechanism that you might have heard is called raising personal support. So individuals building a support team of 50 to 75 individuals, each giving $50 to $75 per month. So this would be in contrast to looking to raise a large amount of money up front, looking for a large specific gift that we intend to fund the church during a gap year, because we're seeing more and more of those dry up. There are places where that's happening. There's a lot of churches that generously give, that will give large amounts to plant a church, but pretty often that's tied to their own church planting endeavors, or it's a very limited number. It can only fund 1 or 2 churches. And as we talk about real multiplication and real expansion, the way that we can send out dozens or more is through the missionary model, that we approach church planting as a missionary. One of the big advantages of this model is it provides a very stable and consistent funding. So there's a lot of church plants or new ministries that start, and maybe they come up with some initial funding and they start with a bank balance, but it can quickly dry up. We worked with a church. They got in touch with us. They had raised quite a bit of money. They'd raised about $70,000 or $80,000 for their first year. And they worked through it through their whole first year, but had because they were a missional church plant and having an amazing effect with the lost, but they had very little local tithe. And so they had essentially run out of funding. And they came to the end of their first year and were not going to be able to continue, because they didn't think about monthly funding. They didn't think about ongoing costs, only about what it took to start, and actually ended up having to fold the church. Now, they were able to partner with another church in the community and give their people a new home. But what was intended, a vision of a new church, ended up not being successful. It wasn't able to thrive because their funding model, because they had all upfront funds without having some stable, consistent monthly funding. The other thing we really like about the missionary model of raising support is it engages the wider body of Christ. So we're all called to be a part of sending or being sent. And by building up a larger support team, you inevitably encounter hundreds of people. Some may be able to give and some can't. But these are then men and women that are praying, they're giving, they're supporting, they're engaged with you on an ongoing basis in your ministry. The word says that where your treasure is, your heart is also. Another way to think of it is that hundreds of people can engage their heart every month with what's happening in a new plant or a new mission. And so it can be a really powerful way to engage the body and have more people involved, even if they can't join in person or join the plant itself. They can be a part of the sending and the commissioning of a new work of a church planter as missionary. And I think one of the key powers of this, when we think of church planter as missionary, is it really reinforces reaching the lost. So when we plant churches, again, where we're trying to engage those who are distant from Christ, or we are moving into broken communities, the funding isn't going to be provided locally. And the kind of traditional missionary world, if you will, has embraced this, that if we're going to go to unreached people groups, that we're going to need to secure our funding from the body and then go and then start a new work. And this is biblical. We see this in Scripture. We see in, let me pull up the verse, in 1 Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 3, it says this: "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem." And so we see in Scripture the first mission agency, they were gathering funds as they had means. They were giving small amounts regularly, and they were sending it with a trusted method. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, of making sure the funds went to their purpose. And this was saying the family today needs to resource and send those who are going to be reaching those with the message of Christ and the gospel. And so we see this model of sending and funding starting in Scripture. So this missionary model is a powerful way we can multiply sending church planters and interns and staff and missionaries. One of the big things with fundraising is that people haven't done it before, or they have a fear that they're going to be able to do it. And what we believe is the missionary model can be successful if with supporting and coaching and training. So for Reliant, this is a lot of what we do specifically, but a lot of people come into this with very little experience in fundraising, very little experience in how this works and follow up and what it takes. And what we have found is with training, support, ongoing coaching, people can be successful in raising their support. There's a lot to it. We spend days doing our training in a very practical way, but it is a skill you can learn, and it's something you can be empowered in. Where other models, in particular, sometimes when we think about large fundraising, it can be tougher to be successful. I will say in fundraising, if however you were doing it, we have found coaching to be one of the most critical pieces. So in the same way that having ongoing support in your life as you're planting a church, the coaching cohorts with V3, what we have found is that getting support and ongoing weekly help as you're raising support is one of the most important things in terms of being successful long term. And so for us, this is something we think more churches, church plants, and ministry should consider. Thinking of church planter as missionary and raising individual support to move away from starting with a tithe-based model or a large upfront donation approach with large gifts drying up and being harder and harder to raise and not being able to multiply. One of the other common ways of creatively planting a church is bivocational church planting. So bivocational, as most of you have probably heard, is the idea that I have two vocations, that I have a church or church plant, but I also have another job that's helping provide my income. There's a few things to think about as you move into a bivocational approach. What is really positive about bivocational is it does enable kind of a lean church planting model, because so often the biggest cost in a church plant in its first few years is the staff and pastors. So by reducing costs on the church, reducing costs on the ministry, you're able to plant in a very lean way. You might be able to even bring a larger team that's starting because they're pursuing their own income And by having another means of providing for themselves, the church can start in a very lean way. And that's very powerful. I think there's 4 key questions to ask before committing to a bivocational approach. The first, and this is one of the most common roadblocks we run into with bivocational, is whether this is actually trivocational or quadvocational. So family or personal needs need a lot of your attention. The church or ministry is calling for a lot of hours and a lot of time. Maybe it's a gig approach, and so there's 2 or 3 jobs trying to provide for it. And actually what started out as trying to be bivocational is actually pulling at all ends. And eventually, whether we mean to or not, we will rob our attention, our best efforts against one of those things. Again, another story, we met a church planter with a family and some needs at home that needed their attention properly, a full-time job that was providing income, and also a church plant that needed nearly full-time hours. And really what we came to conclusion working with them on was that this was unsustainable. That either the family would suffer, which we would never want to see happen as a result of ministry, or the job. So being in the community and having a career, but not putting in strong efforts, that damaging his own witness at his career because he was actually taking time away from his job to focus on other things. He wasn't giving his work its proper effort. And then the ministry, the church itself, wasn't part of the first fruits of their time and attention because everything else was drawing away from it. And so in the end, all 3 ended up suffering. The family was struggling, he was struggling at his job, and the church was struggling. And a consideration of moving to a missionary model to focus on the family needs and the church's needs alone after raising support was a much more successful and sustainable model. And so a real question to ask yourself is about time and attention, and can I be successful? Can I be thriving in all the arenas I'm moving into with a bivocational approach? The next key question moving into bivocational, do I have an existing trade or business? There's a lot of great ideas out there. There's a lot of ways to think about bivocational, but it's typically a pretty bad time to start doing something. So if you are already a software developer, or you already have some consulting, or you already have a business or work that you can pull back from, you're going to be in much better shape to go into bivocational church planting. If you're at a place where you've heard that people who make websites can charge a lot per hour, but you've never done it, that's going to be a bad time to start. If you've heard, I've heard of people who do real estate while they're planting a church, that's going to be a bad time to start, because the time and attention and focus that's needed for it to be successful, for it to thrive and to work long term is going to need your full attention. And so typically where bivocational works really well is a job or career or trade that you already have in place that you can scale to be the kind of right size of time and attention to be able to focus on the church plant. I think another important question, and it's one we do run into as a fundraising agency, is really, am I actually trying to avoid fundraising? There are church planters and models that say we want to embed a community, that we want to be present in the workplaces, in the businesses, that we want those that are part of the core team of the church working in the neighborhood, and it's a strategic way to engage. And tied especially to those other 2 questions, that can be really effective and powerful in a community. We do run into a fear of fundraising, that I would rather be in a job where I might only be making $12, $15 an hour, but we have a perception that it's easier or less scary than fundraising. And at that point, it's not strategic bivocational church planting, it's avoiding what might be the necessary work of engaging the body to help fund the work of the ministry. And so, again, there's us, there's a number of organizations that can help people in training, in confidence, in getting past a fear of fundraising, if that's what's moved people to a bivocational approach. And then lastly, the other question to ask would be, does my community actually need my full attention? And as I said, there are a lot of strategic reasons ministry-wise you might want to embed in the workplaces and in the work of a community. But there is something powerful about being able to give your full attention to the community or to a new flock. You know, I grew up outside of New York. I'm a little more of an urbanite, and but at different points have lived a little more in the country. And in places where it's less dense, it's an amazing blessing to have a volunteer fire force or just part-time doctors. But I think the question we have to ask is now, as a parent, do I want a part-time pediatrician? Am I glad that the first responders in my community, the fire team in my community is full-time? This is their job, is to care for the community. And by being able to be full-time and give full-time attention when a crisis hits, when there's a need, when that phone call or text comes in, you can respond and move into people's lives. And bivocational can often demand a very particular set of time and hours where you're unavailable to meet the needs of the community. I'm a big fan of the parish model, of really trying to own and minister to a geographic community and to say that we feel called to these people and to engage in what's happening in their lives. But a big part of the parish model historically was who is the minister, who are the shepherds that are giving their full time and attention to the people there. And so, again, I think it would tie back to strategy, that if the strategy is a parish model engaging in a community, it might be that being a full-time minister, even with fundraising, is more effective than it would be to be bivocational and have your time going to a career or another kind of money-making endeavor. So I think, you know, the core that we find through those is what's really important is alignment. And we believe moving away from starting with a tithe-based model and being cautious about how you think about bivocational or central-based funding can align the mission of the church with how you're going to fund the people that are involved. A few pitfalls, just a few things when we're thinking about funding in general and these different models that we've experienced and just worked with people for a few years with. The first is this. Selling coffee, commissions, Amazon Smile. And, you know, there's a lot of great companies out there. And there's a lot of them that they're owned by believers. They want to see the mission go forward. And, you know, for each bag of coffee, we'll give $1 or $2 to, you know, the mission. Commissions. Hey, there's a product. Maybe this is something our body could use, the believers could use, and there's a small commission there. Or we see websites. The big one is Amazon Smile. And, oh, if we can just put out this link and people use it, maybe that can fund what we're doing. And what we have found is these are phenomenally small amounts of money. If it was easy to make enough to have a full-time salary from just selling coffee, it would be far more prevalent. Amazon Smile and many of these links, it's very, very small amounts of money. And relatively speaking, compared to fundraising, they tend to be a very inefficient way to raise funds than doing direct fundraising. So we'd caution against depending on those. If something like that can be a little piece of what's happening, or you have a very particular situation that helps, that's great. But to depend on it or to view this as a core way to fund the church or the mission, it's likely not going to be successful. It's not going to have enough. Next is being cautious about direct personal gifts. So fundraising, an important part for success in fundraising is that there is a church or agency or nonprofit involved. So there can be times and ways where people know you're stepping out in mission or stepping out into ministry and they want to fund it. And there might be a small number of people willing to give directly, but there's a lot of pitfalls to people just giving the money directly to another individual. Beyond IRS and tax deduction, it generally speaking brings some concerns over use of funds, over how the money is being used, what's the goal, where does this go? And for some people can can start to feel like this isn't fundraising, but is, again, moving around fundraising, or that the church and organization isn't really taking the organizational needs of documentation, accountability, fraud protection very seriously. So I'd be very cautious in a fundraising model of trying to have it where people are just giving a personal gift to you or to an individual. That has ended up causing a lot of trouble in a lot of places. Next, we'll label it PayPal, but this kind of ties to that one right before it. There's a lot of little tools out there that can enable money to come in, but don't actually do a good job in terms of protecting the funds or tracking where they go or how it's handled institutionally. And usually for not a whole lot money more, you can move up to a more robust system, to a system designed for churches or missions or missionaries, or work with an organization that can put a lot more robust system in place. So to be cautious about, if it's quick, too easy, looks too much like personal gifts, it could get you in trouble. On that note, the next level of that is non-IRS compliant receipting. It sounds very particular, if that's not what you were hoping to hear on a webinar today, but it is a very important one. It can get people in a lot of trouble, and even if they are sampled in an audit, if they have improper donations, it can be removed. And so it isn't usually that the IRS is coming after a church, but there are millions of people that have their tax returns randomly sampled or audited every year. And a really, really common mistake is not having your receipt right, and that could disallow their donation and potentially lead the IRS down another road of all of the receipts you've given out. So again, if you're getting into fundraising, get some advice, find a group that does this, and make sure you're doing it in a way that the IRS is gonna recognize it. And then last, and this is a big thing we focus on with our fundraising, and I'll give a few quick pointers on, if you've never entered into fundraising, a few key ways to approach it. But really, it's apologizing for fundraising. We meet a lot of people that the way they start an appointment, by the way they start raising funds, is with the words, "I'm sorry I have to do this. I know you must hate this." And we start off right off the bat with a belief in our own heart and putting a belief into other people's minds that giving towards mission, that giving towards ministry is inherently the wrong approach, or the wrong way to approach the person, or that you're doing something incorrect. And so it is important to not view fundraising as a wrong or a necessary evil. When we approach fundraising, we have a few key points, and one of them is to ask clearly. So rather than being apologetic, is to share the mission, to share clearly what you're stepping into. And what we say is, a lot of people then, even if they're not apologizing, they approach it with a sit there and look hungry. So shared the mission, shared the need, and then just kind of sit and pause, rather than being clear that one of the needs, in addition to prayer and support and being connected with other people in the community, is financial support. And so being clear that you're asking people if they'd consider faithfully giving anywhere from $50 to $75 a month. That many people give anywhere from $5 to $500 per month, but if they prayerfully consider being a partner at $50 to $75. Again, another little story. We had a church planter once, and he was meeting with someone on their boat. So he was with a person on the boat, shared an impassioned vision for a church plant. The people they were meeting with were bought in, their spirit was moved, and they said, "How can we help? Is there anything we can do to help you?" And he said, "I'll think about it and get back with you." And then he was talking to us and said, "Should I have asked them to give?" And we said, yes, because one of your needs is funding. And so you've actually taken away their ability to respond to the Spirit, to help you, and to be a part of the ministry that's in front of you. And so we're really big on asking clearly, of not moving away from the fact that one of the key needs is funding. And a last point is to in addition to that is to steward the hearts of those who are giving. So as we said, where your treasure is, your heart is also. So these are people who are putting their heart and their mind and their thoughts with you each month. And so it's to thank them, to keep them updated, to do everything you can to have them drawn into the mission and the ministry on an ongoing basis. So a lot of times this looks like kind of a classic prayer letter or update, but it's ways to thank them for what they're doing, to help them see the fruit of the ministry and steward and care for them as they support you. So that's a quick run through of, I think, the key points and the key questions to ask yourself as you're moving into ministry, and to consider the missionary model and fundraising as a new approach and a new way to multiply ministry. So I think we're going to move to some Q&A. I'm glad we have some time left for that.
Actually, yeah. So Tom, actually, I'm going to come in first, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for everybody as well. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm definitely a fan of the missionary model. I've kind of usually when I kind of connect with planters, the first question I ask is, you know, do you see yourself being full-time in mission? Do you see yourself bivocational or not? And if they want to be in full-time mission, I really do think that raising your support like a missionary, especially if you have a missional model of church planting, is the best thing you can do. I personally have, you know, been a part of that for the last 25 years and found that helpful. And obviously I'm a little bit biased. I've been, I was on the first team at Reliant and on the board now, but I'm excited about what Reliant's doing and so forth. I think the other thing that wasn't mentioned is living out here on the West Coast, especially Northwest. You have a lot of people who, like non-Christians, who are either skeptical or cynical of the church, of institution. And if your mindset is like to, you know, if you have to worry about your sustainability and financial, and you start to look at people in that way, that can really be a distraction as well. I think even one of the things that Paul, he didn't even take from the Corinthians because they were suspicious of his motives. And I think people can be suspicious of our motives today. And so raising money through Christians that you know who aren't even, you know, giving that much of a percentage right now on average in the US, one of the richest countries in the world, like I think having people bend their hearts toward the kingdom by getting them on board is a great thing. So I just want to mention that off the bat. I just had a couple questions for you. How many people, so, you know, if someone's kind of thinking, okay, like it's a good idea to raise money in this missionary method, and, you know, Reliant is one group that does that. How many people start the process with Reliant and how many finish? Do you know the percentage there?
It's a very high percentage. I don't have the specific number, but we have a very, very high percentage. And what we have found is it ties far more to the time and attention that can be given to fundraising than it does to, did I come in with what I perceived to be a big network of people, or I know a bunch of rich people, which if we get into it, that is not always the best method for fundraising. Actually, normal people give in this method. So our most common reason for not succeeding is not actually being able to put time and energy into fundraising.
And in my experience, probably the fears that relate to fundraising, like when I think about, as someone who's raised funds and help other people, you know, there's kind of the methodology of what you do. There's the kind of keeping connected with your current partners, but the initial phone call, the initial ask, what are you aware of are the biggest fears that people have of just the process itself?
Some of the biggest fears are how this will feel relationally to the people they're connecting to. And so we do try to help people with, what does that look like? How do you re-engage with someone if you haven't connected with them in a long time? Or believing perception, you will believe that other people aren't comfortable with you asking them for financial support. There's a common example. I have a niece that was raising support, and she sent us a letter, and I kind of lost the letter in a stack of papers, and she never called, she never followed up. And my worry, in her mind, it was, oh, I don't want to ask Uncle Tom. And in my mind, I felt bad because we really wanted to support her. People want to give, and people want to find a way to be a part of what you're doing. So we can believe that people will be offended or bothered, and use that kind of fear to avoid fundraising.
Yeah. I mean, I found like our attitude is probably one of the most important elements to fundraising. I think I know you guys mentioned this resource, or maybe even give it out at the training, but the Spirituality of Fundraising by Henry Nouwen is one of the best small little books that I think you can get free on the internet that speak to kind of our attitude and approach, and just actually finding joy in it. And actually, I mean, I really enjoy the fundraising process. I agree with you. Like, if you get too many big donors, once you lose one or two, you're in a bad spot. But having multiple ones at 50 to 100 is much more steady, much more long-term, and I think very doable. And I know when I was raising my support the very first time, I knew hardly any Christians because I didn't come from a Christian background. I think I knew about 50, just the people in my first church plant, the first church that I was a part of. And most of those were students, so they didn't have a lot of, so most of my ministry team were people that I'd never met before. So what place does referrals play in the whole ability to kind of build your ministry partner team and finish the task?
Referrals are really important. So what we mean by referrals is when you're talking with someone, you're meeting with them, seeing if they're going to be prayerfully a supporter and be a part of it, but also, do they know people that this ministry is something they would want to support and connect to, that this could stir their hearts. And it is fairly common that people will start a process of fundraising, and most of the people that end up supporting them aren't people they knew when they started. In particular, longer-term fundraising. So that tends to produce connections, churches they hadn't met, home groups, other people who are really bought in to the ministry. So it's really important to make connections, and who do they know that might connect you to someone that could be a part of the team.
Yeah, and what's the fastest someone's raised support and the slowest?
The fastest we would count in weeks. What I would say is a lot of it ties back to, at its core, an ability to have an appointment. So we just did a very brief run through here, but it's really important to ask in person, to sit down with someone, cast a vision, connect with them, and make a personal ask. And so we had a guy in New York City who would sometimes have 17, 18 appointments in a week, which is just a huge amount. And so we had a significant financial need by planting in New York City, in Manhattan, and was able to raise it in, I think 2 months or less. And so we've had people where we would measure it more in weeks. The typical can be 6 to 9 months. The longest, you can kind of run into fundraising fatigue. And so time and attention, once you get past 9 months to a year, you're either going to be on a really slow road, or we might advise pausing, of saying, if you don't really have the time and attention to give to fundraising, then maybe this isn't the time to do it. That spending, where you hear stories of people who spent 2 or 3 years, is usually not a real effective method. So typically 6 to 9 months, and some people doing it in as few as 2 and 3 months.
Okay, and then one last question is before we kind of open it up to a question that Lori will kind of pick some of those and ask you. Since the financial crisis back in 2008, I mean, there's a lot of denominations and organizations whose funding is kind of decreasing. What has it been like in this front for Reliant in particular? And I'm familiar with what's happening, but why is it this kind of increasing and potentially the other decreasing?
So during 2008, we saw at a macro level, kind of at an organizational level, we saw no decrease in giving, and no change overall in the time it took to raise funds. So it's a pretty stunning difference than most nonprofits. The average nonprofit in the country decreased significantly, and large gift fundraising all but dried up. Most large donors and most large funds are driven off of retained earnings on stock or business profits. Most missionary model fundraising, the $50, $70, $5 a month, that is simply coming out of people's personal budgets. We did have individuals who said, hey, my town, the town I grew up in, was particularly badly hit, so I've lost 4 or 5 donors who are not working. But in individual situations, but on the whole, we didn't experience a change. In fact, we heard amazing stories of the partners saying, hey, I've lowered my cell phone plan because supporting you is more important. People changing their expenditures for eating out or other things before they would consider not supporting someone that they're bought into. So we saw very, very little change.
And then what about organizationally? Has Reliant grown since that time as a way, of, yeah?
Mm-hmm. We've actually had very consistent growth, again, before and after. I think because this model really has its histories going back to Scripture, it's been a model that a lot of people have used as a creative way to plant a church. I actually think the missional church planting movement and thinking of church planting as missionary has helped us be able to work more broadly than it is even economic changes in the country.
Yep, cool. All right, well, Lori, why don't you kind of start to get some questions from those who are engaged here?
Sure, definitely. One question that we've received is just the idea, is effective fundraising possible for bivocational church planters? What have you seen in your experience, Tom?
Yes, so there'd be 2 kind of answers. One is if it is a strategic bivocational, so let's say it's a 50-50 split, that I'm definitely going to long-term keep 50% of my income coming from a job. And in a traditional way, I'm looking for the church, the ministry I'm doing, to cover the other half. What you'd be raising funds for, though, is the equivalent of half a salary. So what's important in fundraising is to distinguish appropriate income, i.e. it's not a keep everything that comes in. So if it is strategically long-term, half-time one job, half-time church, you determine what that half-time salary should be, and yes, you can raise funds towards it. It can actually be really effective as a means to moving to full-time fundraising. So in the beginning of fundraising, obviously you start with 0 supporters. So those first month or 2, there's no funding coming in. So being bivocational for 3 to 6 months while fundraising, and then drop the bivocational part, and then finish fundraising can be an effective method to get to 100%. But again, if it's strategically bivocational, then your goal, what it will provide, would end up being half of a salary.
Great. And also to follow up, earlier you talked about some almost like how to identify low-hanging fruit for great opportunities for bivocational versus what would not be a good idea to start out of the blue. Can you say more about examples where you've seen someone be really fruitful in their bivocational kind of situation?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, one example was someone who already was a software developer. So they already had a high demand skill or need, and actually just chose to do less work. So they made a choice to say, I will take on less clients. I'm already capable of staying busy, but I'm going to take on less and will therefore live on less so that I can have time to engage in what's happening in the church. So that was definitely one situation that was effective. Another was a sort of business owner who moved towards hiring a person to run their small business. And again, it had an effect because now the business is going to make a little bit less because I've hired someone to really run it day to day. But now he could give partial attention, just kind of give some oversight as an owner of a small business, and now give a lot of time and attention to the church. So those were two cases where there was an existing job or trade and they pulled back.
Got it. Got it. And do you find that in that same vein, consulting kind of professions help, like where there's some sort of expertise, flexibility of schedule?
They do for the lead. If you're bringing a team, there's almost a classic Starbucks approach of, hey, I can work at Starbucks and I might be able to get health benefits and not have to put in 40 hours a week. The downside is they're going to tell you when you have to work. So they're going to say you get the late shift on Saturday unless you happen to be at a place like that where the owner or who is deciding schedule knows your priorities. The freedom to be able to manipulate hours. So in both of those examples, those people could work whenever they wanted to. If they decided, I just need to give my whole day to ministry, I can stay up till 1 or 2 and do my coding or deal with the business. Because it's the who chooses when I work difficulty if you're at kind of a normal job.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've also received a question just around the cost breakdown of a planter. Mm-hmm. You mentioned setting, like a reasonable expectation for income. How do you advise planters to define a number that mm-hmm. they need in order to start kind of, I guess, either shifting away from the bivocational and or at what point do they start fundraising?
Sure. That probably starts to hit the question of, and I don't know if you guys get this a lot, how do I set my salary? So a big question with a church planter that traditional churches or denominations usually solve for people is, well, what should my salary be? So organizations like us and others might be able to provide guidance of here's an appropriate salary starting for the community you're in. Don't starve your family, but don't aim so high that if you're not successful, everything is going to fall. So, and then each person is bringing in a particular financial need. Some people have been blessed to kind of come in, they have no debt. Maybe they don't have very many housing costs and their ability to make a shift is easier than those who might have still some school loans or a mortgage or what have you, and they have to keep a certain income level. So it's hard to come up with a specific number. What we would fall back to is fundraising is most effective with as many hours per week as you can give to it. So an evening and weekend fundraising is going to be very slow. So what we would say is you want to make a shift percentage-wise kind of as soon as you can if your goal is to move to a fundraising model.
Mm-hmm. And can I throw in something like with Reliant, Tom? So are there some criteria that you guys use? Because I know with Reliant, there's not just the coaching and training, but the employment. So what are some of the criteria you guys utilize to discern the financial goal?
In determining the dollar amount, so we've gathered salary survey data from all sorts of resources. Because we work broadly, we can kind of bring a lot of resources to bear. So we have a lot of salary survey information, we have ranges, and we have data on particular cities. So we'll usually work with someone and we say, hey, here's an appropriate range. And then donors or church members can trust, hey, this organization is being modest and careful, but appropriate. And then work with them kind of inside that range. And ideally, also with other people that are helping lead the church for the sake of accountability. Cool. So whether it's advisors or board members or even a church that might be sending them to say, hey, what do you think about this? Is this an appropriate salary to aim for? And then that creates a goal. That benefit costs, expense cost is where you create the goal.
Cool.
Another question, what percentage of the missionaries with Reliant are non-lead planters, like either associate minister or small group leaders, etc.?
Actually, most are not the lead. So we're really passionate about church planters taking the missionary model, but we're over 600, about 640, and maybe a quarter are actually the lead. Something we didn't dive into is we work very broadly with intern and residency programs. So one of the powers of the missionary model is you can bring in interns and residents even if your church budget can't afford them. So in fact, last year among a number of churches, we had 80 to 100 fairly recent college graduates that all ended up at intern and residency programs. And actually coming back to the success number, There were about 4 or 5 that never really launched. They couldn't really do the program. All the rest successfully raised their funds over 3 to 4 months.
Wow,
So,
that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So we see a lot of kind of in getting started, intern or resident, and then because if the church matures, it may have a point at which its tithe can pay the lead, and those supporting team players are raising support.
Yes. And what percentage of what a person fundraises does Reliant take as a part of, just overhead or an administrative sort of fee?
We live on about a tithe, so we live on about 10%. We have a couple different funding numbers, but if we take all 600 some and we add it all up, it's about 10%.
Okay.
It's never, ever more than 12. So the typical person, there's a couple of different little pieces to it, experiences between 8 and 12, and we average 10.
Got it. And how long does the training take? There's just curiosity around once someone signs up, how long it takes before things kind of get moving.
We have a 6 to 8 week application, assessment, background check process before a training. And then we have 2 types of training. Our full-blown 7-day training we hold in Orlando 4 times a year. It's 7 days, so it is quite a time sacrifice, but it's very practical. We do a lot of hands-on practice. We have one happening right now. It is led by people who are actively or have been support-based church planters or church teams. So actually it's 2 pastors that came in. They live a support-based ministry model, and they're training this week. So a lot of practice, a lot of practical. For interns, residents, or for people that are looking for a very particular program for 1 to 2 years, so their goal is less, they have less to raise, we do those around the country, a lot of times partnered with a specific church, and those tend to be 3 to 4 days.
Okay.
So depending on the program, it's 3 or 4 days or a week in Orlando.
That makes sense. And so how has Reliant worked with different denominations? It would seem that some may have more of a familiarity with the missionary model versus others. And I've also received feedback that with staff of Christian ministries, some based on different cultures have had different challenges with fundraising. So could you just speak to that from both sides? One, working with different denominations, as well as success with different cultures that have varying levels of familiarity with monthly giving.
Yes. So with denominations, it's all different depending on the denomination. So we work with a few larger Baptist churches that have a mechanism for that lead person, but no denominational method for supporting staff, or interns and residents. And so then we work just on those. That's also partly why Reliant has a large percentage that aren't the lead. So we have found there's a lot of denominations may have a mechanism for a lead pastor or a lead team, but don't really have a mechanism, interns, residents, supporting people. Some denominations have something like this set up, and we just say, hey, if we can bless the denomination and everybody gets better at it, that's great. And then some have no mechanism. So what they have said is denominations that only do a central funding model, meaning they've pooled all their money and they've said, we're going to choose of our money 4 people the denomination is going to fund. They will send the people who don't make the top 4 or whatever that number is to us and saying, hey, unfortunately, we can't, fully fund you from our central pool, but you can't, if you need to raise your support, we don't have a mechanism for it. And so we can work with Reliant. We don't have a denomination, that we can't work with.
Yes.
The cultural one is difficult. So unfortunately, there are cultures and ethnic groups and communities that aren't familiar with this model, and it can definitely create some difficulty. What we have found is the biggest help is ongoing coaching. So because the work can be a little bit harder, or might take more meetings to be successful, might take more connections, us walking alongside them more deliberately is even more important. So more encouragement, more strategy, really making sure they're set up for success, where yeah, we've seen people, they happen to be in a church community that love supporting missionaries, and lots of people they know. They almost know. You come in and you talk about support, and they already know what this is, and they're getting out the credit card before you even discussed it. And it just takes more energy in those communities. We've also been trying to learn from different cultures. What is it? Is there a way we're communicating that isn't the right language for the people you're connected to? So we actually are trying to learn and grow better in that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know that that there are probably more questions. So hopefully, if you have more, I would love for you all to connect with Tom. He would be happy to, he and his staff would be happy to answer any more questions that you have. We want to thank you all so much for joining. And here you can receive how to reach out, tom.mauriello@reliant.org.